Hi.
Well, congratulations on that film. It's quite the watch, even the second time around for me.
Thanks.
I was reading. I had a little in my research. I was reading your director's statement from the last film that you made, Inshallah Democracy, and I see that you say in it, "I'm exactly the kind of person that militants want dead: a liberal, secular filmmaker and Muslim from a minority sect." So, why do you make films like this? What drives you?
Well, the genesis of this film was that Storyville had approached me that they wanted to make a film on the blasphemy law in Pakistan. It was as wide a scope as that initially, and I had declined, and because it's incredibly dangerous to do so. I mean. As you saw in the film, and there's so many examples, Governor Tasir was killed for speaking out about Asia Bibi. Other politicians who have tried to make amendments or changes to the blasphemy law have also met with similar circumstances. So I just didn't want to do that. Then in November of 2017, I happened to be in Islamabad when Khadim Hussain Rizvi basically held the whole city under siege in a way. This was when the parliament had passed these new language for their electoral oath, and it was kind of seen as a move towards taking out Islamic references and seen essentially as a way of relaxing eventually the blasphemy law. And so the cleric Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who was the leader of the Tehreek-e-Lakhbak party, immediately took to the streets with his followers, blocked the entire city, and eventually won. I mean, he got the parliament to rescind the law, got the law minister to resign, and then even had the government pay out 1,000 rupees to some of the protesters as reparations. And I was like, oh, hell no. I just didn't sit well with me as a Pakistani, and even as a Muslim, to have someone like this person represent my faith and actually make the government cow down. And I figured, he had to be stopped. And so that's kind of what was the impetus to begin following him and editorially following his storyline.
Okay, so how did you go about doing it? Because the 360-degree access is quite remarkable. And how did you present yourself and the film that you were making to people who you weren't necessarily in agreement with?
So I have to say, I have an incredible team behind me, and I have two co-producers, Syed Musharraf Shah and Mohsen Abbas, and then of course we also had other field producers. So it was kind of a strategy, because we had to be kind of careful in terms of security as well, that all the different characters that we had, the subjects that we had, no one producer would be focusing on them full time. So even what you see with Khadim Hussain Rizvi, we had actually just 2 interviews with him, and then a lot of his street activities and stuff we followed throughout like an 18-month period, and he was fairly open in terms of giving interviews and access, and we were upfront with them. We didn't misrepresent anything. But one of the main things that we had to tell them, and something that was really obvious when I was doing the editorial of the film, is that we had to try to maintain as a brutally neutral stance as we could, and that was something that was really easy to do with this film. Is editorially, I had to really exercise restraint, and it was very easy to kind of portray him as this kind of, in some ways he's a lot of fun. He's very charismatic. He's a Bond villain. He's in a wheelchair, and for nonfiction filmmakers, he is exciting that way. But I wanted him to tell his side of the story and not editorialize or embellish anything. And I had to be very, very careful of doing that. And it wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was also a safety choice. And that neutrality is essentially why we were able to kind of get the access that we were able to.
So you said this is a film about the blasphemy law. Is that how you said it was?
No. So it was approached that we will be covering, of course, the blasphemy law and your electoral campaign, but we will be all showing both sides. So we'll be also showing people who have been accused and, telling their side of the story. And then, of course, you're going to be showing your side of the story.
And what has anybody seen it that's in the film?
Not yet. I mean, literally, we just started showing this week. Like, this is the previous.
I mean, what do you think that they will make of it?
I think the protagonists and all that would be happy with their their portrayal. I mean, I don't know. I can't really say. I mean, subjects, of course, have their own bias when they're looking at themselves. It's like a natural human instinct.
Sure.
So I don't know. It would be difficult for me to speak, but I at least definitely strived my best to portray them in the most neutral light that I could. So yeah.
And this neutrality plays into the title as well?
Yes. I mean, the title, the international title is just The Accused.
Okay. Storyville like to put their own explainers on their titles.
So damned or devoted is what this is the byline. That's essentially true. I mean, the followers or the people who are accused are either damned, or some people can see them as devoted. But The Accused is the international title.
I'm going to open it up in just a second because I know that there'll be lots of questions. I just say, can you talk a little bit then about how you go about with your crew in staying safe?
Well, there's different strategies that are employed. And this is not the first time that I'm doing this. I did another film called Among the Believers a few years back, in which I followed another really right-wing militant cleric by the name of Maulana Abdulaziz, and he was affiliated with the Red Mosque, which is this fairly hard-lined mosque in Islamabad. And he's a ISIS supporter and a Taliban ally. And I only bring this reference up is because in that, a lot of the threats and safety issues that we had were obviously once the film came out. And it was all a lot through social media. And it was new terrain for us because it's like, well, okay, how do you kind of manage that threat? The same rules I'd applied at that time to following a very neutral tone. But in this social media culture, unfortunately, people don't really watch the film. They just react immediately to knee-jerk reactions of Western reviews of the film or what other people are saying about the film, but they haven't actually seen it. And because of that, of course, I got a lot of hate mail, death threats, and a lot of my crew people did too. So essentially what we had to do was I went back to Pakistan and I showed the cleric the movie. And I recorded him seeing it. And I had him issue a statement afterwards. And I uploaded that to YouTube. And his statement was, this film is fine. It shows my point of view. It shows the other side's point of view as well. And I don't find any problem with it. And once we uploaded that, the threats kind of dissipated. Over here, we are in contact with Rizvi's party as well. And obviously, it's a little premature to say what it is, and I don't want to preempt any security issues from now. But if we have to take such kind of measures in the future, then obviously we will. So let's see. Well,
it's disconcerting, I think, to have a contributor with a mob at his fingertips.
Yes. Yes. Or, and my previous film was on a military dictator, and he has the intelligence and army at his fingertips.
Yes.
And then before that, I have Maulana Abdulaziz. So
no puppy documentaries for you then, huh?
This is something that this is just me as a filmmaker, especially in the last 10 years, where I always felt initially when I was making films, I'm very proud of my earlier work, certainly, But there came a point where I kind of felt uncomfortable following only the victim's narrative.
Right.
And that is because I think the dynamic of power is so off, where I, as a filmmaker who is, I might be Pakistani, but I'm certainly coming in from a much more privileged background. I'm, coming from a Western, my films are commissioned by like Western channels and stuff here. That even though I had informed them of everything, it was informed consent and everything, I just felt uncomfortable. And then you start, other questions come up of like the Western gaze and like kind of like orientalizing certain stories or kind of perpetuating like a poverty porn kind of culture. And for me, what worked was then that instead I would like to tell the story through the traditional oppressor, if you will, or the anti-hero, right? There's an equal footing, definitely, in case actually they're more powerful than I am. And second of all, these guys tend to be narcissists, so they do like the camera, so that helps. Yeah.
Really interesting. Yes, there's a question down here, and then we'll go to the back, please. And we've got a mic coming round.
Thank you very much. I wanted to say that, as a Pakistani liberal myself, one view I have is, oh gosh, you're showing a reasonable enemy, the fundamentalist. You're reasoning with him. So one side of me thinks, why should you give so much space to him? Which it kind of downplays my position as a Pakistani liberal, right? But then the other side of me realizes, the other side of me says, oh no, you're trying to be neutral and you're attempting to show different perspectives, and this is just one project of many for you. So, but when there's probably few like you who have such expertise, and I'm from a research field myself, who have an expertise in understanding Islam in Pakistan. You as an expert now of somewhat of the TLP in Pakistan, would you say that they're a cult of sacrifice, or are they just kind of, are they motivated by the sacrificial element, which is what it seems that they are, because a lot of the statements are about, we want to get our heads chopped off. We don't want to chop off everyone else's head, right? Which is the slight distinction that was made in the translation, at least. So would you agree that that's what you aim to present them as, a cult of sacrifice?
Well, I should clarify, I don't consider myself an expertise in Islam or necessarily Pakistani politics. Of course, I'm immersed in it purely because of the story that I'm telling, and I would say my focus is very, very specific and limited to the subject matter or the characters that I'm covering. And in that case, yeah, I'm just giving a disclaimer because I feel a little uncomfortable saying that I'm some expertise or academic in Islam. I'm certainly not. I think Rizvi is not, and the TLP party is not necessarily rare in Pakistan, where we do certainly have overnight political parties that kind of rise up, and he has this message of well, he's definitely using the blasphemy law as a mandate to draw a lot of power towards him and support towards him. And in fact, the majority of Pakistanis support the blasphemy law. But what I think contributes to his overnight success is that he's also espousing to be the new savior, where he's going to push an Islamic socialist populist agenda. And it is going to be new from what the elite corrupt politicians of mainstream politics have always promised. And I think that's what kind of made him so popular, because he was talking about and talking for the issues of the common man, which largely they're ignored. And in that way, he kind of became like this larger-than-life figure. And I think he started presenting himself as more of like a peer. And if you're familiar with like a peer culture, where like they kind of are almost might not be the most accurate description, but in English, but more like like spiritual saintly figures, exactly, that have some really divine connection to God. And a lot of people really, I mean, you saw some of the devotion, like when he was getting run out of jail, people were on the police wagon. So he's really regarded as that. And is it a cult of sacrifice? I think there's certainly certain supporters who are that fanatical, who would totally sacrifice themselves, whether that is in getting their own heads chopped off, or whether that is in actually engaging in an act of jihad and chopping heads off. So either way, and the reason I say that is because if you look at the blasphemy law, there are a significant amount of cases of people being lynched before they even make it to trial. Mm-hmm. So that's an important point to bring up, is that once you're accused of blasphemy, it's like that's it. You're almost as good as dead in certain circumstances. It is such a visceral and reaction. So, yeah.
There's a question in the back, please.
Hello. I had two questions. The first one is, will you show this film in Pakistan? And the second question is, if the West could develop a coherent policy versus Pakistan, what could that policy be to reduce the partisanship in the country?
So I would love to show this in Pakistan. I don't know how realistic that is, given my other films have also been banned back home. This one most probably would be, just given the content and the subject matter. However, having said that, I do manage to host lots of screenings back home. They just tend to be just private screenings or just underground screenings that we all kind of arrange. And so that way I hope to kind of get the message out in universities and other places in Pakistan, and, once it's time to kind of show there. As far as what a message is for the West to adopt, well, I would like to say that one of the really important things for me to showcase voices like Gulalai, Ismail, or even, Anika, the lawyer who's defending Patris Misi, is that we have our own indigenous voices that are actually so brave and are standing up against such an immense threat. And there are also Muslims in Pakistan who are standing up against people like Khadim Hussain Rizvi. And I think those are the voices that need space and need to be featured and, embraced, rather than always kind of giving the space to, fanatics, per se. And I think what's important is, even in a place like Pakistan, ultimately it was the Supreme Court and the Shariat Court that made the correct ruling, and they found Asia Bibi not guilty. Mm-hmm. So it is something that they did themselves. And I think, I don't know how much the West can do that. I think sometimes when the West gets involved, it kind of ruins things and destabilizes it, because it then kind of gives it much more of a political factor. I'm
sure Trump could help with this situation.
Exactly.
So there was, yes, a woman in the middle here. There's three of you in a row. Does it go?
Thanks. I like your picture very much. I think it's very well done. And I guess my question is that, do you consider that the growing support for blasphemy, do you think that, do you consider it as a signal of populism, or do you consider it as a sad alternative of decolonization, that it's a very desperate response to, say, westernization? Do you think, because I do sense this kind of desperate, the people who supported it, they are the consequence of, say, like the international influences, if you get my question. Yes, thanks.
Well, I'll try my best to answer the question. I think that's a very long and very interesting question that I think a lot of people can speak about and for hours. But historically, the blasphemy law was a remnant of the British colonial period. So when we were a colony, the British actually had implemented the blasphemy law. And it was to basically safeguard all religious sentiments. So it wasn't just Muslims. It wasn't until 1986, under General Ziaul Haq, a military dictator in the 80s, that additional provisions were made in the law that basically added the death penalty, and specifically the death penalty for if you insulted the Prophet. So the Islamization of the laws, and I also don't like using the word Islamization because I think that's not necessarily the most accurate, but because it was specifically General Ziaul Haq's own kind of like dictatorial take on things that he was imposing. That certainly grew.
Is it growing much? Can you characterize the support as growing in the last 10 years, and what is?
I think it certainly grew in the last few years purely because of Khadim Hussain Rizvi. The last 10 years I can't really comment on. I mean, I could say, for example, that there have been an escalation of reported blasphemy cases in like the early from like 2010 to 2013. And that's just data. I don't know if I can specifically then deduce from that data that means there's more support for the blasphemy law. That would be maybe academically a little reaching, right? So
we have time for one quick question, and then we'll wrap up. So yes,
Mr. Naqvi, I would like to thank you for your incredible bravery making this film, in showing the face and the activities of the TLP, which is, in my personal opinion, and I don't say this lightly, pure Nazism. I found the previous question a little uncomfortable because, of course, 3 million Germans were also very impoverished in the early 1930s, and that obviously there was someone to step in with exactly the same rhetoric that you were ascribing to Rizvi just now in answer to a previous question. Now, my question is actually about the diaspora and how the diaspora ties into this issue. When I've had the pleasure of speaking to Pakistanis who are in the UK, whether to study or whatever else, they've consistently commented on the relative conservatism of the UK Pakistani diaspora. And of course, if any Pakistanis are here and who disagree, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Sorry, can you just be a bit quicker because we're really out of time? And can you get to the question?
Okay, of course. Well, I mean, it's not gone unnoticed because of this that there was, for instance, when Mr. Taseer was murdered, that there was a sizable, considerable proportion of the diaspora here who actually came out in support of Qadri, the murderer. And there's of course plenty of anti-Ahmadi sentiment as well, which also ties into this. I was wondering if you could comment on how the diaspora perhaps exacerbates or abets this situation, or on the converse, in your opinion, whether there are ways in which they can do more to combat it.
I think the diaspora in the UK, or not just the UK, worldwide Pakistani diaspora, is not a monolith. So you do have a spectrum of ideas and beliefs where on the one hand, you will have people even here in the UK who really support people like Qadri, and then there are people on the other end who don't at all. And pretty much parallel, mirroring what you'd find in Pakistan. And I think the reason is because a lot of people who are immigrating and going abroad, they're bringing with them their cultural values or their spiritual values from the time that they left Pakistan. And so I think maybe what is important is to realize that spirituality, Islam itself, or Pakistanis themselves aren't one. It's disingenuous to paint all of them with one wide brushstroke. I think that's dangerous, and this is almost like a different topic, because then it kind of perpetuates Islamophobia in Western countries, and I think that's a different topic, certainly. But I think if there are people who were protesting or supporting Qadri, you'd find an equal amount of people, especially here in the UK, who are diasporas or expats, who would be also condemning people like the TLP or Rizvi. So yeah.
Well, thank you again for the film. It is certainly a brave film, and I wish you luck going forward, and stay safe. And thank you to everybody for staying.
Thank you so much. Thanks.